I love how much passion we can show for a topic like bank reconciliation.
Yeah, I hear myself sometimes getting excited about that. Automated reconciliation. CSV imports.
Welcome to Finance in the Clouds. Modern finance is broken, forcing finance and accounting teams to work like it's 1985, the year Excel was invented. Here we talk about the struggles finance teams face in fast-growing companies and discuss how they can spend less time surviving and more time in the clouds. I'm your host, Jake Jones, multimedia producer and brand influencer here at Zone & Co. And I'm joined this week by Jurian van Maanen, Vice President of Expansion Apps and Sales at Zone & Co., and Stephen Murray, Managing Director at Scarecrow. Thanks for joining me today, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Payment reconciliation can be one of the most time-consuming parts of a finance team's workload. Today, we're going to discuss the modernizations changing the payment reconciliation process and how they can unlock efficiencies and growth at your company. But before we jump into that, I do want to give a little space for Jurian and Steven to kind of introduce yourselves, let us get to know you guys a little bit better. So Jurian, why don't we start with you? Who are you? What's kind of your background, and what do you do for us here at Zone?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so first of all, Jake, thank you so much for inviting me today. Like, I've been listening quite religiously to the podcast so far, really enjoyed it. So it's so exciting to join today for this topic. So my name, as you mentioned, is Jurian van Maanen. I'm responsible for the sales of what we call expansions apps at Zone & Co. Before that, I had a similar role at Fast4. And Fast4 was acquired by Zone & Co. in January of this year. As a company, we started out as a NetSuite implementation partner. And while we were doing implementations, we found some areas in the system where we thought, hey, we could make these processes even better. And what's really great about NetSuite, it acts as a platform as well. You can develop on top of it. So we developed applications for NetSuite to automate certain key financial processes. Around banking, around AP automation. So I think the banking one we'll definitely touch on today. And we had over 800 customers using our apps at the time we were acquired. If you look at my own personal background, I have a financial background. So I started out as an accountant, got to work with NetSuite, figured out I actually like the software side and NetSuite a lot more even than the finance side. So switched to implementing NetSuite. Did that for a couple of years and then switched to a sales role. So I can use those financial experience to help companies that are going through their own financial transformation process. So that's me in a nutshell.
Absolutely. And thank you for properly pronouncing your name. I'm sorry I butchered it there at the beginning, but I'm still learning Dutch, so I'll get there eventually.
I also don't have the easiest Dutch name to pronounce, so I won't hold it against you. Don't worry.
There you go. Thank you. And then we also have Steven. Steven, why don't you introduce yourself? What do you do at Scarecrow, and how did you kind of get involved with Fast4 and then now Zone & Co?
Okay, yeah, well, thanks for having us. To echo Jurian's thoughts, really excited to be here, having listened to the last few episodes. And obviously, to follow up really cruelly, you've got a man with a Scottish accent after a man with a Dutch accent. So good luck, Jake, in terms of putting all this together. Hope everyone follows it. I'm Managing Director here at Scarecrow. We are a digital marketing agency. We've been going for a little over 2.5 years now, nearly 3 years. And I got here a little bit circuitously, having studied marketing whilst I was at university. I then actually went and worked with a software provider and worked for a solution provider of NetSuite for just over 10 years. After we launched, we've actually been working quite closely due to my experience in the NetSuite and the ERP marketplace. We've been working with a few solution providers and SDN suite app providers like yourselves. And we started working with the team at Fast4 not long after we launched the business, and have continued to do so. And as their business and their app marketplace has grown, our business has grown alongside it. It's turned into a really fruitful relationship. And obviously with the recent acquisition, now supporting in the sort of international development of the messaging and the positioning for the Zone apps. It's a really exciting thing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both again for being here. Really excited to have both of your perspectives and experience on this topic. And without further ado, let's just jump in. So, this topic kind of sparked from a conversation between you and I, Stephen, that we were kind of a part of about payment reconciliation. And I'm a little bit unfamiliar with the topic myself. And so you were kind of describing it to me, and you kind of used this word gateway paradox. And we all kind of chuckled about it in the moment. But it was really kind of an interesting picture. And so I was wondering if you could maybe, just to kind of get us kicked off here, what did you kind of mean by a gateway paradox in regards to reconciliation?
Yeah, well, apart from being like a great name for a prog band, I think we kind of stumbled across it in terms of talking about probably one of the most common challenges for all businesses when we're talking about software. And actually, I think Hilk spoke about it back in the podcast you've done with him in terms of scaling and some of the mistakes he felt he'd made. The gateway paradox is the same as a lot of software paradoxes in terms of it really depends on what your business needs at the time. And the ideal scenario is always to have the best of everything. But in the real world, that's impossible. And it comes on day one, you need to start with doing and making sure the doing gets done. And as the business grows and evolves, you can then spend more time and more budget to finesse the processes and start focusing on getting the information that you need to drive better decisions. And I think in terms of how we positioned it and why we were discussing it was in terms of payment gateways, like I actually mentioned in the introduction, is they're a necessity now for almost every business, even service-focused businesses who want to take online payments because customers expect it, right? Be it portals or pay now buttons on invoices or whatever it is, people expect that ease of payment. So you have to have a service provider to facilitate the payment. And the paradox comes from, if you're using them, you have one option, which is from a financial point of view to bring in a summarised total from the payment gateway provider who take all the cash for you and pay it into your bank. And then we'll tell you, yesterday we took $1,000 for you and here it is. And the easy way to manage that in the finance system is just to bring it in as a total of $1,000 and say we took $1,000 card payments yesterday. And job's done from the financial perspective, certainly. What you don't get from that, though, is the fact that it was 100 transactions of $10 for orders for T-shirts that then actually had to be shipped, and what was the whole process that went into that manually. So the paradox, the reference really came from, we have to have the payment gateway provider to facilitate the purchases from the customers. But if we were to reconcile every single transaction individually, that's a pretty back-breaking process that would get in the way of actually shipping the orders and getting on with getting more customers and more orders and growing the business. And to be honest, that's before we even get into some of the complexities that brings in terms of the gateway providers' fees and everything like that as well. So you've got this paradox of wanting to sell more, but the more you sell, the more reconciliation you have to do, the more operational processing you have to do. So really looking at the whole process and what you're trying to achieve and what point is the right point to start using the data better and putting more effort and more cost there into it, but getting more out of it to drive better business decisions.
Yeah. There's definitely almost a hill that you kind of are teetering on of when do you want to make that leap to make more product, but also have to struggle with these complications that you mentioned. So, Jurian, I'd love to hear your perspective on this, just from your experience as well.
Like, actually, interestingly enough, I was having a conversation recently with this with a customer, and we were talking about sort of financial transformation. And it's basically one-on-one what you just described, Stephen, and sort of hearing you explain this, you could almost argue that this particular process is sort of one of the first symptoms that you'll run into to sort of show you, hey, I need that financial transformation, right? Because you're going to go to a payment service provider. Usually when you do that, you start realizing, okay, you know what? Now that we're a growing business, now that we need more real-time data available in our system, we don't want that lump sum anymore. We want to have that transactional data. And that almost opens up sort of all the challenges you then get within that that financial transformation when you go into that next step. Because okay, now we have all that transactional data, but how are we now gonna keep track of which individual transaction has already been paid out, which one is already reconciled? And it's actually a pretty interesting topic, because if you look at, I really like the way you describe that as sort of that tipping point. For me, that sometimes is when sort of the focus shifts from just sales and go to market to, hey, now we need to become more strategical. Now we need to start becoming a bit more forward thinking. This process and sort of this difficulty with payment service providers tends to be one of sort of the first things that companies run into as an issue.
We're talking about this in simplistic terms, but I mean, it gets even more complicated than what you're talking about. Stephen, you kind of brought up that there's also the fee from the gateway company that you're using to get credit card payments and that sort of thing. So this is all just a very, very complicated thing. What are some of the big issues that you run into with gateway reconciliation, and kind of what is gateway reconciliation?
If you look at what are payment service providers, if as a company you're accepting, usually we see it with online payments, so payments that are accepted via a web store. There are also other scenarios, but usually with online payments. One way that you can do that is to pick your favorite payment method. So let's say PayPal. I don't know if I'm allowed to advertise on the show, Jake, but let's use PayPal as an example.
We'll allow it.
And you build.
Yeah, we'll split the royalties, Jurian.
we'll check it after. And you build a direct integration with PayPal. You put a PayPal button on your website. Customers can pay, and you will receive that money on your account. What you see is that when you start moving into multiple markets, not all markets want to pay with PayPal, as good as a product as that is, but maybe like if you look at in Holland, we have something called Ideal, which was built by the banks, which everyone wants that when they are paying for an online order. And each market has one of those payment methods. So as soon as you are going to go for a strategy where you're trying to sell products online in multiple markets, it makes no sense anymore to start building connections between your website and between your ERP and all those different payment methods. So then those payment service providers come in and they build those connections to all those different payment methods. They take care of the transaction on, in this example, your web store, and they will then pay out the money they collect for that transaction. So reconciling here means that usually those transactions I just described live in a different platform than your ERP system. That usually happens in your web store. Those get synced to your ERP system, and then you need to figure out, hey, am I getting all those orders in from my web store to my ERP, and are all those orders actually paid out by my payment service provider, and what fees did they charge to provide me that service? That is very simplistically sort of the concept of the PSP reconciliation.
Mm-hmm. And that's really mostly just for online payments. Like if I'm getting cash orders or check orders, that's not really something that I'm worried about or as concerned about, right?
Well, you might still be worried or concerned about it. I see it as a slightly separate process from sort of this payment service providers reconciliation.
As well, Jake, in terms of like kind of omni-channel side of things, like payment service providers would also be tip and PIN or contactless card machines, payments over the phone. Someone, obviously, I think when we are saying PayPal, everyone's thinking of buying a product online. It could also be paying for a service, say via a portal or that kind of thing, which it's just huge. Certainly in sort of UK, European, and my trips to the States, credit card is the default payment method. Normally, it's not or cash, obviously, but it's a huge element of the economy, and one of the advantages that these companies bring as well is a compliance perspective for companies of any size. So Scarecrow, we're quite a small business. I wouldn't have the infrastructure or budget or anything to try and actually store and manage customer card details. which is why it's the same as anything else that you can outsource, but these companies bring that and manage that whole process for you, and that's what they take their fee for. But it's got a huge industry and a huge part of, from a small local news agent right through to international corporations. Anyone processing any kind of card or kind of digital payment now will have normally some kind of gateway for it to move through.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes total sense to me. I kind of had two different directions I wanted to go here, but I guess the first one, how would a company kind of recognize, we've kind of talked about this tipping point, and this is kind of the paradox, right? Of, are you ready? Is your business ready to take that jump and make that move? What are some kind of factors that you guys would call out to help someone identify that, hey, maybe my company is ready to look into some kind of software that can help with this reconciliation? What are some of those calling cards you would look for in your business to kind of know this is something I need to consider?
So I can mention two examples, and then maybe Stephen, you can jump in with some additional examples. I think one of them is when companies see that they're just lacking data that they would really like to have available. If you look at this process, what I see a lot is that within the financial system, companies want to get order level details. So they don't want to see their sales per day or per week, sometimes even. The CFO says, if I want to do my reporting, if I want to drive the right strategical decisions, I want to see what that one number represents, like what products were sold, what customers were buying those products. So there's a lack of that data, and that's usually a sign to say, okay, you know what, maybe the way that we are now doing it with our different systems doesn't work, and we need to look at a financial setup where that is supported. The second thing that I think is always an obvious but a big flag is just that the company is growing and the team is not managing, and there's too much manual work, and there's a need of automation, right? The payments are being reconciled, but it's being done by someone going through an Excel file, manually ticking all the boxes, spending hours on it, while there's also still a backlog of plenty of other tasks that they can work on. When you have that type of manual work and you say, you know what, this could easily be automated, that's usually also a flag that, hey, that answer probably is out there, and it might be the time for you to start and go look for it.
The only other occasion where I've been called in to have discussions around about these things is usually after a pretty expensive mistake, which is what everyone is usually trying to avoid. But the challenge, I think, can be in seeing it in terms of the staff normally involved in doing these processes aren't necessarily the most vocal or visible in the organisation. It's and I think this is changing for the good. But best times probably to ask this question is as soon as you start working with payment service providers or payment gateways. And that probably applies across the board as well, because what we see is as soon as you start introducing another link in the chain of how you get from A to Z, that's where complications, if not immediately, that's where they'll appear in the future. So if on day one it's okay but you're only doing 10 transactions, the aim is probably to get to 100 and then 1,000 transactions. So I think there's a really strong argument at that point is a really good time to look at the question, well, what is the best way to get this right, both for just now and for the future, and try and prevent the complexity ever actually occurring. Because you can say that about anything, but I think if you've got the core, if you look, the core system is correct, but it's going to have to evolve over time, the challenges come the more you start adding roundabout the side of that, which is NetSuite's whole sales message, right? So if at that point, if on day one you can look and say, is there a way to actually prevent this ever occurring? Can we get it right from day one? It means then as the business scales, it just scales. You don't have to bring in more people to do more manual tasks and actually start firefighting. You just prevent it.
So you guys have brought up a lot of topics I kind of want to chase down, but just to kind of segue from this one, what are kind of the risks if you maybe wait to make that jump too long? What are some of the risks if you don't find a good solution to your reconciliation? How is that going to affect your company moving forward?
It's actually quite easy to get sidetracked into purely the kind of financial and operational side of things as well. In all honesty, from my experience, one of the biggest risks is frustrating good people in your organisation. If you look at just the practical element of reconciling, if you have to reconcile every single transaction, by the very nature, the more transactions you do, which is the aim of the business, the more there is to reconcile. And if you do it all manually, it's a really intense, tedious process. There's enough margin for error. I mean, the whole reconciliation kind of removes the margin for error. That's its purpose, but you can still make errors which the system prevents you from reconciling. You have to go back and work out where it goes wrong. So I think that's a massive risk that's really worth considering. You know, how much of my people's valuable time is being used on this, and by used I mean how much are we paying valuable people to get really angry about working here? Which is what nobody's looking for that now, right? In the whole marketplace has shifted, especially with the change in culture over the last 3 years with the pandemic. You know, there is people looking inwardly about what their job means and what they want to achieve from their career. So don't ask them to do something that's going to drive them away. From a more financial side, I look at this as a business owner as well, and this is probably where the paradox comes from. Of it's horses for courses. Of ultimately the cash ends up in the bank, and from a payment gateway provider perspective, it usually gets there quicker than otherwise as well. So that's an advantage, so that probably reduces some of the risk. For me, it's not like you're sending out an invoice for millions of dollars and waiting for the millions of dollars to come in. Millions of dollars in the bank, right? So that makes it a bit easier to worry about what do we do with it next. I think that the problem probably comes from that of we're talking purely financial at the moment as well. But if we go back to the example of selling 100 t-shirts at $10, those 100 t-shirts still have to be taken off the shelf, put in a bag or a box or whatever, and posted, shipped, marked as completed, and then posted through the finance team to let them know to close off the transaction based on the $1,000 which come in. So I think that's a bigger challenge in terms of you look at the actual end-to-end process. Unless it's automated, there's something somewhere is going to have to wear the manual brunt of what that looks like. And NetSuite is, in my experience, one of, if not the only solution that gives you that end-to-end sales order through to dispatch and invoicing process, which leaves the only final bit to do once you've got all of this amazing customer and order data is do the manual reconciliation of all the transactions. So if you can automate that final step, then you've got the perfect solution. You get the customer actually does the work for you by placing the order and making the payment. You get the cash in the bank. The warehouse team get the automatic notification to dispatch the stuff, and by doing that, it closes off the transaction. It's just that last bit of putting the two together. And Zone Payments obviously is conveniently sponsors of the podcast have the solution to do that.
Well, yeah, that's kind of the direction I want to go next. Is just kind of like, let's talk about some solutions. And obviously, we have a lot of apps that have a lot of great tools that relate to this. But even just generally speaking, like what sort of tools should someone be looking to? I know we've mentioned automation a lot, so that may be just the simple answer. But Jurian, why don't you take it from there? What are some of the solutions out there to help with this reconciliation gateway paradox? So,
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've been solving it for our customers for quite some time. So, like, I guess you can put them in a few different buckets, right? Customers can decide to just build their own fully integration. So, build an integration from their ERP to their payment service provider. Complicated, takes quite some time. We've built a solution actually with our bank reconciliation tool, which acts as a middleman within NetSuite. It can import the data from those payment service providers and then automate that reconciliation for you. So we will match that to transactions in NetSuite. We will make sure that the commission fees are getting processed. That's really purely focusing on the reconciliation part. And then there's also some sort of all-inclusive solutions. So I know that there are some PSP providers on the market that have those all-inclusive solutions for NetSuite. And we're developing one with Zone as well, right? So with Zone Payments, we're going to introduce that a tool that will support that down the line for multiple payment service providers that will both automate the reconciliation part, but also much more, because now we're sort of focusing on one piece here, so the reconciliation. But luckily, there's more processes that you can automate within this as well. Like one of my all-time favorites is, okay, we have the reconciliation in order. Now we want to refund an order, and then a lot of the times it immediately turns into manual work again. We're back into logging into the backend of that provider and processing that refund. And I think there we're going to launch some really cool stuff that will automate even more processes than just the reconciliation piece.
Absolutely. Thanks for teasing a little bit of that too there, Jurian. I love it. How does really just automating, how does automating these processes, how is that going to affect these finance teams' workload? I mean, obviously you would think with automation it would be lighter, but I guess even beyond that, what is that going to open up for them to do?
Like, I think it's two things. Like that maybe tie in a little bit also with the answer to Stephen. So it's taking away the manual work, obviously, keeping people happy. Like one of the things that I also think is quite an important part of this, and that will bring the finance team a lot of joy, is it gives you real-time checks and balances. So like reconciliation for a large part is also just making sure everything is going correctly, and sort of towards the PSP provider, that is, hey, are they actually paying out these amounts? Are they taking the commissions amounts they promised? But also from an order perspective, if all of a sudden you're receiving money and you cannot put a transaction towards it, it might indicate that there's an issue with your order flow. And if you're a finance person and you find that out after 6 months, it's like, oh, our financial reporting actually wasn't correct the past 6 months, which can lead to some joyous moments. So yes, it takes away many work. It also just gives peace of mind that you have a constant check that those data streams are going correctly.
Yeah, I can only imagine that going the opposite direction too, of just you find something that was wrong and it's not a positive. that is terrifying. So just the fact that you can be caught up on your reconciliation too, I think is a really interesting point. Go ahead, Stephen. What were you going to say?
Yeah, no, I think the more Jurian talks, the clearer it becomes in terms of just how complex a process this is, and it's something I always speak to my own team about. So the example I've been giving so far of the 100 t-shirts at $10, that's not what we're talking about. No, I'm not aware of anyone who can afford NetSuite selling 100 t-shirts at $10. We're talking about quite even small businesses in terms of the world. We're talking about big business. They'll be selling on their own website. They'll be selling usually via Amazon, probably eBay, other online marketplaces. I was listening to the Masters of Scale podcast the other day. The guys at GoPuff, that seem pretty big in the States. There are all these online marketplaces, delivery services, courier services, etc. And it gets so complex so quickly, and quite often now with high volume of low value transactions. The complexities that come in is, Jurian mentioned refunds, and again in the online retail space, that's a really complex thing in terms of people buying multiple versions of one item on purpose, knowing that they're going to be sending 60-70% of their order back. So the financial implications of that, the operational processes of that. The other kind of things that we haven't even touched on as well is that, although I said that the cash comes in the bank quicker, which is great, it comes in the bank on a disbursement schedule from the gateway provider. So if you select to have that daily, it means you have a lot more work to do. If you select that to be every third, fifth, seventh day, it means that there's payments coming in a week after the payment's been received. So you receive it on a different date from the payment date. And if someone's paid $10, you're getting $9.72 of that because the PSP has taken a fee for it. So suddenly, if you multiply that out to taking thousands into hundreds of thousands of orders with returns, payments being made on different dates and received in different amounts, and you're having to manage that whole thing. Things like the fees, so your literal cash, can become almost impossible to track, especially if you're doing it manually. So it can be easy for payment gateway providers to accidentally take too much, for example, or usually payment schedules, and you'll get more one month than you meant to, and get less the next month, and they balance it out. But it becomes really complex really quickly.
One thing I'm kind of hearing just as we continue talking about this is it is so complicated, and if it's complicated and you don't have a system that supports you with this, that means someone on your team is struggling with this complexity. And I think, as we've talked about, there's so much room for error, and obviously the human element is there's a lot of room for error. And so it really does, kind of to surmise all of this, it really is important that you have a system in place, whatever that may be, to make sure that you're reconciling all of this correctly, because it really can be a detriment to not just your business, but also your team. And so that's so important.
Yeah, well, we come up with what was supposedly, well, we found it in a self-congratulatory manner quite funny for Fast Four about a year ago. There's a really famous Steve Jobs quote of, we don't hire the best people to tell them what to do. We hire the best people for them to tell us what to do. And we were like, well, yeah, we don't hire the best people to make them fill in spreadsheets. What's the point in going and recruiting really clever staff and like, there's your laptop, there's Excel. See you next week. We'll give you more Excel spreadsheets. It's not what we're in it for. People weren't meant to do that. It's getting them looking at the data, spotting trends, but what else could customers buy? What else does this mean? What can we do with the cash that we've received, rather than literally click, 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 error, fix, click, and move on. I'm really passionate about that side of things as well as the cash side of things.
Yeah, I love how much passion we can show for a topic like bank reconciliation. No, but if you dive into it, it's actually it's so complex and so interesting.
Yeah, I hear myself sometimes getting excited about that automated reconciliation, CSV imports.
Because it is exciting, Stephen. It's not you. It is exciting.
Yeah,
it is. It is. Jurian and Stephen, thank you both so much for joining us today, and we've had a great conversation about all the complexities of reconciliation and just how important it is to really be something that you solve for and really pay attention to in your company and in your business. So it was great hearing both of your perspectives.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jake. I really enjoyed participating in the conversation, and really enjoyed the podcast so far. So super happy to be part of it.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having us. It's a great conversation.
And now we want to hear from you. What is keeping you from a reconciliation solution for your business? Let us know by emailing hello@zoneandco.com. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe to Finance in the Clouds wherever you get your podcasts, and we will see you next time. Bye.